All right. Well, welcome to first ever Young Americans for Liberty podcast. My name is Aaron Ricks. I'm the president of the Young High School chapter of the Young Americans for Liberty. Along with me in here is Kyle Peabody and Michael Lee, senior members of the club. We're delighted to have as our first guest Mr. Tom Woods. Mr. Woods is a senior fellow at the Ludwig von Mises Institute. Now, Mr. Woods, your new book just released a week or two ago, Meltdown, a free market look at why the stock market collapsed, the economy tanked, and the government bailouts to make things worse. Now, personally, I really dove into the theory of Austrian economics a little more than a year ago, around the time I started paying attention to the Ron Paul campaign and listening to Peter Schiff interviews, which, as everyone says, are very amusing. Now, as a high school student, I read your book, or at least most of it. I didn't have the time I would have liked to go through it. I'll be the first to admit that advanced economics theory isn't something easy to grasp. Now, the first book I read was Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson. Easy to understand, the logic was compelling. Now, it seems to me your book kind of reaches to the same audience, those without experience in economic theory. But at the same time, it kind of tells the world this is what happened, this is what's going on, and this is how we got here. So, Mr. Woods, we're going to try to talk about the economy, make a miracle without pushing equities down 5%. So, what did you hope to accomplish with this new book?
Well, more or less as you said, I wanted the average American to be able to read this thing, understand what's going on, how we got here, and what we can do to get out. And so far, I've been getting emails and website comments that people submit to me through my site, just telling me that this is exactly what's happened. That now they understand it better than ever. They weren't quite sure what was going on. But in particular, I mean, you'll notice the book is coming out, very, very quickly. I mean, if you read it, you find that it talks about events that are going through December 2008. So for the publisher to be able to get it out that quickly was just a wonderful thing. And so I raced to write and finish this thing because I did not want the conventional wisdom, which is that, the free market has failed, and so now we need all the geniuses in Washington who are our wise rulers to take over the economy for us. I just did not want that to go unchallenged, and I figured I'd be able to beat most books on the subject. There'll be a lot of books coming out this year, and they're going to be disastrous, basically. And in fact, my book Meltdown has a foreword by Ron Paul in which he says exactly that I'm pretty sure there's going to be an avalanche of books, and they're all going to be a disaster. So I figured I would, sort of do one for the good guys, get it out there, make it marginally harder for the media to pretend that the free market interpretation of all this doesn't exist. And the sales of it so far, I mean, it's too early to get any hard figures, but I mean, it's selling like crazy. So I'm hopeful that it will gum up the works a little bit, as I say, as they try to claim that this is a big failure of the free market. I wanted the book to counter them, but also to help people who support the free market to make the arguments, to learn what the arguments are so that they can defend themselves.
Yeah. Definitely, the argument is here. The media can't pretend that we don't have an argument, and it's right here in your book, and there's been tons of articles available at the Ludwig von Mises Institute. Now, a few questions that I've kind of gathered from a few of my friends. I live in New York. It's definitely left of center. So one of the questions they had for you was, also reading your book, is greed. Greed as a cause for a financial collapse. What do you have to say about that?
Well, I feel like an explanation that relies on greed really begs the question. I mean, why did people suddenly become greedy in the 21st century? I mean, this seems to be pretty unsatisfying. I mean, the question would have to be, I guess I'd put it this way. Everybody's, part of human nature is that people can be greedy. That's just unavoidable. So the question is, what institutional framework can cope the best with this undeniable aspect of human nature? And seems to me the free market copes the best with it, because if you want to improve your material well-being, how do you do that in a genuine free market? In a genuine free market, you do that by doing something that pleases your fellow man. That's how you get his money, legally. That's how you get his money. So that's the institutional framework that in effect helps us best cope with greed. Whereas a framework that is statist, that's dominated by government, is not so helpful. Because the greedy people just wind up in government, and they use government to line their own pockets and loot the rest of the population. Whereas, a businessman has to get the voluntary consent of his customer. Nobody in government needs the voluntary consent of anybody. They're the government. They have a monopoly on violence. So when I look at this crisis and people try to tell me it's caused by greed, well, look, of course there are some greedy people, no question about that, but what kind of environment is it in which greed can lead to an outcome like this? And what I want to argue is that explanations that simply refer to greed leave out the institutional factors that allow greed to flourish. And those institutional factors would be, for instance, the unmentionable Federal Reserve System, which pumps, in this case, literally insane amounts of money into the system, thereby lowering interest rates below where the free market would have set them. And this, makes banks respond. I mean, banks respond when their bank is full of fresh reserves created by the Fed. Well, they're going to lend it out, and that's not greed per se. That's just the natural course of events for a bank. They've got reserves. They burn a hole in their pockets. They don't know what to do with it. And so when the banks see that they've got all these reserves to lend, well, they've got to make that money available on easier terms than before. Because at any given time, the banks are all lent up to the limit they're allowed to. So if they're going to find new people to lend to, these new people are either going to have to get lower interest rates to entice them to borrow all this new money, or these people are going to be people who have lower credit ratings and are not as creditworthy. Something needs to be done in order to move all this new money out the door. And sure, the banks make a pile of dough on this, and they're doing great, but as I say, it's not greed per se. It's, well, who put all these reserves there in the first place? It's the Fed. I mean, we have to look at the Federal Reserve System as a key factor in this, and what typically happens is the Fed, which most Americans don't know the first thing about, and they hear Federal Reserve and they just clam up. They figure, this is too complicated, I can never understand it. I wrote Meltdown so the average person could understand the Fed, and it's essential that we understand it because the Fed will screw up the economy, and then because the Fed is never allowed to be mentioned in the media, hardly ever, never mentioned in our political system, the consequences of what the Fed does are then blamed stupidly on the free market. It just goes to show the free market is unstable. The free market is surprisingly stable, but it becomes unstable when you intervene in it, and that's what the Fed does. The Fed's very existence is a violation of the free market.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. It's just, to me, it sounded like almost a misnomer. Like there's no tangible evidence behind the whole argument that greed causes a financial collapse. Now, one of the things I commend you for is you mentioned panics and crashes even before the Federal Reserve's coming to existence. They were still these crashes are still a function of the same exact principles that we see in later booms and busts when the Federal Reserve was created. Can you elaborate a bit on these previous panics and crashes?
Yeah, sure. And let me try and do like a 90-second overview of what the Austrian School of Economics teaches about this. Because what the Austrian school teaches and what F.A. Hayek won the Nobel Prize for was arguing that, basically there are two ways interest rates can come down. One is that you and I save more. And when we save more, then, the banks have more to lend, so interest rates come down. But another way that interest rates can come down is that the central bank forces them down through its interventions. And according to Hayek, there are different consequences for the economy of each of these two cases. When you and I save more, and that's what's bringing the interest rates down, that's fine, that's good. The economy can sustain that, because when the interest rates are lower, that's when businesses, particularly engaged in long-term projects, are more likely to invest because, well, they don't have to pay as high interest. And that's good because when you and I save more, that means we're not consuming as much now. We're going to consume more in the future. And so businesses are borrowing this money to go out and create projects that are aimed at future production of goods. So that's good. We're going to consume in the future, and they're producing for the future. It's wonderful. But if interest rates come down just because the central bank forces them down, well, now we've got a time mismatch, because now investors once again will invest in long-term projects aimed at the future, but we haven't necessarily indicated a desire to consume less in the present to fund these investments. In fact, we may even be consuming just as much or more than before. So meanwhile, you've got investors investing for the future, but consumers are demanding more of existing goods right now. You've got investors engaged in product development at a time when Americans want more of existing products right now. So there's a time mismatch. And secondly, when you and I save more, the fact that we're not consuming as much releases resources that investors can use to finish their investment projects. But when the interest rate comes down just because it's been artificially forced down, Well, that doesn't magically produce all the physical goods necessary to finish all the investment projects that businessmen will start. So they're going to find that they cannot afford to finish a lot of these projects. So in other words, when you interfere with interest rates and you don't let the free market set them, you disrupt this delicate coordinating mechanism that coordinates production across time. Now this, as I say, this won the Nobel Prize, this theory. But what you will often hear people say is, okay, even if I grant you that, this is why we have these booms and busts, it doesn't account for all the booms and busts and panics and recessions and depressions we had before we had a Federal Reserve System. How can you blame that on the Fed? And the